All right, Bismillah. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to the event. My name is Rami Awad. I serve on the Stanford Muslim Student Union board, and I want to thank you all for coming to our MSU event today. We're thrilled to have everyone here. The structure of the event will be a quick biography on our speaker, followed by his presentation of the subject, Why We Believe in God, Implications of a Godless Worldview. I'll just be accepting people while I'm doing this. At the end, we'll have a Q&A session for anyone to pose any questions they may have. Now I'll give a biography on our speaker and we'll begin inshallah, God willing. Fahad Tasleem serves on the head of U.S. outreach for IERA, the Islamic Education and Research Academy. He is also a research fellow at Sapiens Institute. His diverse study and research interests include Quranic studies, Dawah, Islamic and comparative theology, behavioral economics, economic history, and Arabic linguistics. Fahad holds a bachelor's in economics from Michigan State University and a master's in business taxation from the University of Southern California. Fahad studied Arabic at Georgetown University and studied in the graduate program in Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Texas at Austin with a focus on Islamic theology. MashaAllah, MashaAllah. Thank you for making this happen today, Shaykh Fahad. May Allah reward you, and I'll let you take it away. Bismillah.
All right. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala rasulih al-kareem amma ba'd. So first of all, you can hear me, right? Just want to confirm.
Yes.
All right. I'm coming through loud and clear. Okay. Sounds good.
Alhamdulillah.
So inshallah, today what I wanted to focus on as we think about the topic at hand and the implications of holding a godless worldview. This conversation that we're going to have is going to focus in kind of two primary areas. One is the idea of meaning, right? And so we want to think about, like the meaning of meaning, for lack of a better term. The second thing we want to look at is the idea of a worldview, in the sense that there is a certain paradigm that a person would find themselves in, either by way of birth, and many people find themselves in an Islamic paradigm by way of birth, or by way of choice. Nevertheless, the conversation that I'm hoping we're going to have is going to revolve around these two areas. Okay. Now, why have I chosen these two areas? Number one, it's because human beings intrinsically, they crave meaning. And you can have, coming to the point about the worldview, you can have a worldview that can give a person meaning. And when I talk about meaning, I don't mean just limited to, let's say, what does it mean to, like do certain things? What does it mean to study at Stanford, right? But what I'm talking about is more of an existential question, questions about our existence. So the meaning of life, the meaning of death, and so on. So what you find is that there's certain worldviews that can provide people with deep meanings, and then certain worldviews that are going to be devoid of meaning. And of course, one of the things that we want to understand very clearly, and what the point that I'm trying to get across, is that a worldview based on atheism is completely devoid of meaning. And many times this type of worldview would lead people to a type of nihilism, or just this idea of just complete meaninglessness, that there's no meaning whatsoever. Now that's all fair and that's fine, but someone, let's say, holding to this view or holding this worldview of atheism, and I'll get into what I mean by atheism in a few minutes, but someone may ask the question, okay, you've decided to take on the topic of meaning and look at it from the perspective of a person's worldview or a person's paradigm. But what about truth? I mean, what about rationality? Don't these things have some sort of benefit, or some sort of, shouldn't we be looking at things in a way that is rational? And shouldn't we be concerned about the truth, whether we find meaning or not? And so what I find is that a lot of times when we are looking at the concept of arriving at truth, even that is dependent upon a person's worldview. And of course, needless to say, in the day and age that we're living in, you'll find that, that whatever sort of background you come from, truth can be of a premium, right? So if you're coming from a background that is, in some sections, part of the conservative political spectrum, you may have a distrust of the media. You may have a distrust of the scientific endeavor. You may have a distrust of the government itself. And so that can lead to this idea of, well, how does that worldview give you an idea of what is true and what isn't true? On the other side of the spectrum, you may be coming from, let's say, more of a liberal tint or more of a leftist tint, and your let's say skepticism or your idea of how do we come to truth, and the fact that perhaps we can't come to truth might be defined by things like postmodernism and the idea that truth can be relative, and so that would have ramifications on the idea of truth itself. But all of whatever sort of leaning or whatever sort of worldview that a person's coming from, what we need to understand is that when we think about the concept of rationality itself, most people would consider rationality to be in one of two camps. That you have certain things that are rational and certain things that are irrational. And so what I'm going to present tonight, before we get to the concept of worldview and meaning and all of that, is to dig down a little bit on the concept of rationality itself. Because what I'm presenting tonight is to say that, in fact, rationality doesn't only have two categories, that which is rational and that which is irrational, but in fact, there's three categories of rationality. So just to make this simple, a rational statement is like a simple statement that makes sense, right? So if I said, I am Fahad, that is a very simple, rational statement, right? And its truth value can be weighed. You can say it's either true or false. An irrational statement might be something to the effect of, if I said that, if I said that today I'll be presenting to you a square circle. Now, you may say, okay, well, that's not really rational because a square by definition has four sides and a circle is devoid of four sides, doesn't have four sides, it's round. And so how can you bring something that has four sides and yet does not have four sides at the same time? So that would be an irrational statement. But again, I would say that in fact, you have a third quality. And that third quality or that third area of rationality is what you would call, what I would term the super rational, that which lies outside of rationality. And the reality is that if a person does not accept this third category, accepting rationality itself would be fruitless. Okay. And this is where our discussion can enter into the concept of skepticism. Because when you think about a question in which you're using your mind, using rationality, and you say, I'm going to limit myself only to rationality. I'm only going to use, from the Arabic terminology, I'm only going to use my aql, right? This is solely based on, my clear thought. Now, if that's the case, one of the rational question that's going to arise, no matter what you're presented with, is a question of why. So your idea will start with some sort of a doubt, and then you'll look for a proof to establish, to clarify that doubt. And so you'll ask the question, why? The problem that arises, however, is that there is no theorem that is infinitely defendable. You cannot ask why forever, right? And so the example I give all the time, I say, imagine if my son, he comes to the kitchen and he takes out the knife from from its place, okay? And Rami's heard this example, so my apologies, Rami. Anyway, so he takes out the knife from the kitchen, and I tell him, I say, Abdurrahman, put the knife back. And he says, why? And I say, well, because it's sharp and it'll cut you. He says, why? I said, well, because it's sharp. He says, well, why? I said, well, because the manufacturer made it that way. He says, why? I said, well, because, we need sharp knife to cut things. He says, why? I said, because perhaps there's more utility in a fruit that's cut. He says, why? And so on, right? Now, the problem is that you cannot ask why. He cannot ask why infinitely. At a certain point, I'm going to tell him, because I said so, right? Because I'm your dad. That's why. I may get frustrated. And it just goes to highlight the point that there's no theorem that is infinitely defendable. You cannot ask why, and you cannot doubt infinitely, right? And so therefore, by necessity, the rational endeavor requires something outside of it that you cannot prove, but you accept to be true. Now, in the realm of philosophy, they call these basic beliefs, first principles, axioms, axiomatic truths, and so on. But the idea is that because you have a theorem that no theorem is infinitely defendable, you can't ask why forever. The only place that you can get to is some sort of extreme skepticism. And philosophers of the past, reached that point all the way back to, I think, Alexander the Great. There was a philosopher, I think his name was Pyrrhon, if I'm not mistaken, Pyrrhon of Isis. I think that's what his name was. And they say that he accompanied Alexander the Great all the way up to India. So if you know about Alexander the Great, 4th century, he went all the way up to the Ganges River, and when he got there, he wanted to keep going, and his soldiers said, "Look, we've had enough. We want to go back home." So one of the philosophers that went with him was Pyrrhon, and he adopted, by studying with some Buddhists, he adopted this extreme skepticism. And so this extreme skepticism is known as Pyrrhonism, right? Pyrrhonism, something like that. And it's a type of philosophical skepticism where it basically, it leads you to a type of trilemma. And there's other forms of this trilemma as well, right? So you have what's known as Monkhussen's trilemma. And it's the same idea, that is that there is an impossibility of proving the truth. Okay, especially if you're looking for proof for every single doubt that a person has. Okay, so just to kind of to dig into this a bit deeper, Monkhussen's trilemma is such that he says that that there's no way to prove any truth. So just like a dilemma where you have two choices and neither one is correct, or you're not going to be able to come to a conclusion with either one. Similarly, a trilemma works the same way. The idea is that there's no conclusion. There's no way to come out of it. So Monkhussen's trilemma basically says, when he asks the question about proving the truth, he says, really, there's only three options, right? And it kind of mirrors what I was talking about, the super-rational, rationality, and that being irrational. But he says that if you're trying to prove any truth, you're going to have, either you're going to come to the conclusion of a circular argument, in the sense that if you're going to rely on rationality itself and try to prove something, you're going to come up to the point where you're going to say, it's true because it's true. And that's it. Now, that's not really a proof, but it's just kind of it just falls back on itself. Or you're going to fall into what's known as a regressive argument, this idea of just going back ad infinitum, which leads to an extreme skepticism. And I'll mention a problem with that as well in a second. Or he says there's dogmatic argument. In other words, you come to a point where you have to rely on something you cannot prove. And that, because the circular argument doesn't work, it just turns back on itself. It is because it is not intellectually satisfying at all. Regressive argument, you can't go back ad infinitum. There's no reality to infinity, right? There may be a mathematical infinity. There's no reality to it, though. So really, your third option is your only option, dogmatic argument. Now, someone may say, well, you could just stick with the dogmatic argument and say, well, I'm just going to doubt everything. There's a problem with that, though, because if you doubt everything, you're going to be led to a point where you have to doubt your doubt, which leaves you, again, intellectually paralyzed. So by necessity, you cannot rely on just your rationality. There has to be something outside of it that you can hang your hat on, that you cannot prove. It's not irrational, but it lies outside of rationality. Okay. In Islam, in the Islamic parlance, we call this that lies outside of rationality. Well, we were saying it's called the supra-rational, but in Islamic parlance, we say that would be something like the fitrah, right? So the fitrah is the natural primordial base nature that the human being has been created upon, right? So Allah in the Quran mentions fitrat Allah allati fatara an-nas alayha. It is the fitrah that Allah has created every human being upon. And part of this fitrah is logical arguments. You cannot argue with someone past the point of the logical principle. If I said, I'm a married bachelor, and you were saying, well, no, that doesn't make any sense. And I would say, why? And you say, well, that's not, logically doesn't flow. You can't be married and a bachelor at the same time, right? You can't, even if you're Muslim and you say, okay, I can have 4 wives, that still doesn't work, right? Because the idea is, once you're a bachelor, you're not married. Once you're married, you cease being a bachelor, right? And you can't have both. These are what's known as two ideas that are mutually exclusive. Now, what if I say, I don't believe in the principle, prove the principle of mutual exclusivity. Now you're stuck because there's no proof to the principle. You start with the logical principle. And so logical principles form part of what we call the fitra, or the super rational. Other things that are part of the fitra, just for your own kind of knowledge, or just to understand the concept of fitra, is the idea of understanding, or the idea of seeking truth, right? And when we'll talk in a minute about things like meta language, but the idea of seeking truth is part of the fitra. Like, why doesn't a person just seek falsehood? Why is truth considered a virtue? Another idea is the idea of recognition of beauty, or an aesthetic sense that you might have, a sense of smell, recognizing things that smell good and things that smell bad. So all of these form part of what we call the fitra in the Islamic parlance. For our purposes, we can say that which lies outside of rationality, or the super rational. Okay. Now, just to kind of dig down a bit deeper into this, these ideas also, we understand them from the point of view of our language. Like, when we speak, we have a certain type of terminology that we use, and we cannot go beyond certain baseline terms, right? What we call part of that, those terms that form part of what we call our meta language. Okay. So if we think about ethical terms, terms like generosity, humility, you have those terms that are primary, they have a primary nature, and they have those terms that these terms are based upon, which is secondary. So primary terms like generosity and humility are descriptive. Secondary terms are evaluative. In other words, they give you an evaluation of that particular term. Okay. So what I mean by that is, in terms of this dichotomy between primary and secondary, and being descriptive and evaluative, is the idea that if you ask the question, is generosity? Well, you can say generosity is good, but then, so generosity is your primary descriptive term. Good is your secondary evaluative term. You're using good to give an evaluation of something that you're describing, right? Similarly, humility, it's good, but you're not going to ask, well, is good good? Right? You have to have a stopping point, even in terms of your language. Now, a lot of Christian philosophers talk about the concept of what they call the true, the good, and the beautiful. In other words, they, in a sense, consider these three terms as being part of our meta language. You cannot go beyond them. So someone would ask, why do you believe X? Because it's true. Well, why do you want Y? Well, because it's good. Well, why do you look at Z? Because it's beautiful. Now, you don't give kind of a deeper explanation beyond that, right? Because then you get into some area of skepticism, and we just spoke about that. Kind of the example sometimes I give people from the concept of beauty, like, why do you look at Z? And you say, because it's beautiful, and you don't go beyond that, because that concept of beauty is part of our super rational, or from, again, the Islamic terminology, part of our fitrah. So when we say, like, if you're out and you see this beautiful sunset, right? I use the term beautiful. Let's say we see a sunset and you're with your spouse or a friend, and you say, man, that sunset is just absolutely gorgeous. I'm just in a state of awe. I'm awestruck by just the sunset itself. And your friend or your spouse says, that is the ugliest thing I've ever seen. Prove to me rationally that that's beautiful. Well, that's not a question of rationality, right? This is a question that has to do with something else. So with that understanding that if we say that we're only going to see things from a rational perspective only, that leads to problems in and of itself. By necessity, we have to have something outside of the rationality. And philosophers recognize this very clearly, like I mentioned, that you have to have certain terms. Now, whether we're talking about philosophy in general, or we're talking about philosophy in specific areas, so this philosophy of science understands first principles or basic beliefs or axioms as well. And we can get into that in the Q&A. But coming back to what I was saying, from that perspective, let's come back to the idea of meaning and worldview, okay? When we're speaking about the worldview that is what we say the Islamic worldview, we understand that it is full of content, it is full of meaning. And yet when you compare that to an atheist worldview, or a worldview that is devoid of God or a creator or anything like that, we find that it is, frankly, just it is missing meaning, and meaning on a number of different levels. When I say an atheist worldview, let me just clarify that, okay? I'm specifically referring to someone who does not believe in a creator or has doubts about a creator. So we're looking at someone who's an atheist, or someone who may be, let's say, an agnostic from one perspective, right? And they've come to a certain conclusion and they fall under something called naturalism, and specifically philosophical naturalism. So naturalism is the idea or the concept, and this is the idea and concept that's used in any sort of scientific endeavor that a person is to study anywhere right now, right, in any university. So naturalism basically states that the only way to explain phenomena are by reference to things that are natural or things that are in nature, right? And so therefore, any sort of supernatural explanation, not supranatural, supernatural explanation is not valid. It has to be a natural explanation. But this worldview, if when we move this from the realm of a method in science, so as a method, it works fine. You can say, okay, that's the assumption I have. We're only going to give naturalistic explanations. But once that moves from the realm of science to everything, it moves from a method to a philosophy. And it's called philosophical naturalism. So once it moves there, there are certain assumptions or there's certain ideas that form part of philosophical naturalism. Those ideas being that the natural process or the natural processes are random, that there's no sort of intentionality behind these processes, right? Because again, if you assign intentionality, it means you are now entering into the realm of the supernatural, right? Or from one perspective, you're entering into a metaphysical discussion, that which is beyond the physical. However, for someone who subscribes to an atheist or let's say a philosophical naturalistic worldview, the idea is that things happen by way of random processes. They happen by way of random processes, and therefore there's no intentionality behind it. Or perhaps vice versa, because there's no intentionality, they're random. But in addition to that, not only is there no intentionality behind the processes, and not only is that they're random, but also there's no rationality behind it, right? Because you're not going to get rationality from non-rationality. And so therefore, because the processes are random, there's no intentionality behind it. There's no rationality behind it. And in essence, they are blind. So they're blind, non-rational, non-intentional, random processes. This worldview that we're talking about, what I'm trying to present is to say that this worldview, and we're not talking about proving or disproving or whatever it might be, but this very worldview has certain ramifications, certain logical conclusions that directly affect meaning. So you as a human being, when you're looking for some sort of stability in terms of your worldview, that stability is missing from this worldview, okay? And we'll look at why it's missing from a number of different perspectives, right? And it has to do primarily with meaning itself. The idea is that, and from the Islamic perspective, the Quran, or we would say Allah, mentions this type of idea, that the one that turns away. So in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or God Almighty, says, وَمَنْ أَعْرَضَ عَنْ ذِكْرِي فَإِنَّ لَهُ مَعِيشَةً دَنْكَ. So and whoever turns away from my remembrance, for him is going to be a difficult life. It's an interesting kind of side point here, is that the Quran, and maybe we can get into this if we talk a little bit about semiotics in the end related to meaning, if we have time. But one of the interesting features about the Quran is that there's also not only the meaning of the words themselves, but the acoustics sometimes give a type of feeling, for lack of a better term, right? That kind of hits the person. So you have the idea of a difficult life. The word for difficult life, or a depressed life, or a very hard life, signifies this idea of kind of heaviness and difficulty. The acoustics there are in the term itself, ma'ishta donka. It's like donk. So you almost feel it at your into your core. But anyhow, that's not the topic. The idea is, from the Islamic perspective, we understand that a worldview that takes God out of it, this is something that has a direct ramification on things like meaning. Okay. Now, from what area am I talking about? When Allah is taken out of the picture, and the worldview is one of that dictates randomness, non-intentionality, non-rationality, and just blind processes, we see that therefore the logical conclusion is that this person can have no sense of hope, no sense of value, like in order to give things value, no purpose, and no kind of meaningful happiness, right? And we'll take each one of these one by one. So when I speak about hope, I'm not talking about I hope I get a job, but what we're talking about here is ultimate hope. Now, let's take a step back. When we talk about hope or ultimate hope, the idea of hope is the feeling or expectation or desire for something to happen. You hope for something, right? When a person denies, let's say, God or a concept of a hereafter, it renders the concept of hope meaningless, right? And you can again, the worldview that we're talking about here is one that is random, non-rational, non-intentional. And by the way, when I say non-rational, I don't mean that people who are subscribed to this worldview don't think and are not rational. We're saying the process that we're talking about would necessarily not come from a state of rationality. Otherwise, that would signify something that's, that has some sort of meaning. Anyhow, so a person that's in this sort of worldview, what would hope be for this person? So imagine now that they go to, someone's child is killed, and they want to offer condolences. What kind of condolences would they give? What kind of hope would they be able to put forward? They say, I'm sorry, your son died. Now he has moved from one state of physical composition to another state of physical composition. And there's really no hope. It's just, you move from one physical set of atoms, molecules to another set of physical. So condolences now, where would the hope be? If a person is, let's say, in a state of suffering for their entire life, and there's no hope for anything to happen afterwards, what kind of, how does a person like that move forward? A life of suffering, and there's no hope. You just end up from one physical state to another physical state. But someone may say, well, wait a minute. What about the person that's having fun? They're enjoying their life. Why do they care about hope? But even for that person, again, we're talking about ultimate hope, that when they die, the idea would be for that enjoyment to continue and increase. And there's no hope for that. Now, from this perspective, it's completely devoid of hope. There's no concept of hope. There's no idea. And again, we're talking about the logical conclusion. Naturally, a person can have that hope. It may be in nothing, and it can come about. I think I posted something recently on my Instagram, a poem from Emily Dickinson. And I think it was something to the effect of that hope is that which fetters in the heart or fetters in the soul, right? And it sings a wordless tune. And it was beautiful the way that hope is described. And at the end, the end of the poem, it describes this idea that, that hope is that thing that it never leaves a person, right? In the most trying of circumstances, right? And you can check my Insta, or maybe I'll send it to you guys if you have it. It's a very beautiful poem speaking about beauty and truth and meaning and all goodness and all of that. But again, so the person under this worldview cannot logically come to a conclusion of hope in terms of ultimate hope. Again, they can hope for things in their life, like I hope I get this job, but yet when it comes to ultimate hope, there's nothing there. There's no content in that worldview. Now, if you juxtapose that with the Islamic worldview, you find that it is full of hope, starting from who Allah is, who God is. He is Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, the one who is the most merciful and the most forgiving. That a person that has this worldview, that the worldview of Islam, they understand that they can be extremely hopeful, that when they die, there's something at the end that's waiting for them. When their loved ones die, you can offer condolences to bolster the person and say that, that your loved one is going to, is going to be in a better place, inshallah, and so on. So from the perspective or from the worldview of Islam, you find that is full of content, especially related to the concept of hope, that it gives a tremendous amount of hope for the human being that's, traversing through the vicissitudes of life, let's say. There's an immense amount of hope from the Islamic framework. The other concept that becomes problematic in terms of meaning and life itself is the concept of absolute justice, or not absolute, sorry, ultimate justice. Absolute justice, I always tell my kids this, like, absolute justice only for the hereafter. But anyway, so ultimate justice is what I'm talking about here, right? One of the things that we know about this temporary world is that you will never come to a state of absolute justice, right? And that's the appropriate use of the term, I hope. That you don't ever come to a state of absolute justice. There will always be things that are not accounted for. So under a worldview where all processes are random and they come from a source that's non-rational, there's no intentionality behind it, they're blind processes, justice or absolute justice is an unachievable goal from this worldview, from this sort of area, right? So, you think about someone like Hitler, to give, somewhat of an example from modernity. Like Hitler, he killed 6 million Jews or whatever it might be, however, whatever the number is, some astronomical number of people, and yet he only suffers one death. Someone may say, well, that's really unfair. I heard someone else say, well, he at the end of his life, he was really depressed. And so, basically all of that suffering, he basically, that was accounted for. Yeah, maybe from his perspective, but what about the justice for the lady who is now going to enter the gas chamber with her infant child? Where's the justice for her? Right? So there's no concept of ultimate justice at the end. In fact, when a person is under the worldview of philosophical naturalism or atheism, or atheists who believe in philosophical naturalism, the hold of philosophical naturalism, uh, there is a type of equating that's happening. So in other words, that type of person will say, well, if you look at someone like Hitler and you look at someone like Moses, they end up in the same place. They go from one physical state to another physical state. And so therefore, they're basically the same. So whatever they do in their life, no matter how much good you do, no matter how much evil you do, you still end up the same. And in fact, the Quran highlights this as well. The Quran, it mentions, أَفَنَجْعَلُ الْمُسْلِمِينَ كَالْمُجْرِمِينَ. Will you say, or will you equate, will you make equal those people who are Muslim, and here we're talking about people who submit to God, who worship God, and so on, will you equate those people with criminals? Malakum, kayfa tahkumun? What's the matter with you? How is this a proper judgment? Right? So in that worldview, the logical conclusion is that there is no concept or no idea of ultimate justice. Now, I want to just reiterate something here, and that is what I'm presenting right now are not some sort of philosophically deep rational arguments. And that's why I preceded our discussion to talk about rationality and, in a sense, its limitation, right? What I'm presenting here today is that if you have this worldview of processes being random, non-rational, non-intentional, there are certain logical conclusions. That doesn't mean that you will go to those conclusions, but that means that if you take it to its logical end, this is where it ends up. And this has a direct implication on a person and their quest for meaning in life. So people, they have a deep sense of justice. Even children, like at a very young age, they have this intuitive sense of justice. There's this intuitive sense of hope, and so on and so forth. So under this worldview, there's no concept of hope. There's no concept of ultimate value. Now, if I asked you, what's the difference in value between me and, let's say, this mic here? Like, is there any difference? Like if you, took a hammer and slammed me on the head, and you took a hammer and slammed the mic, I mean, is there really any difference in value between us? Because in essence, this is made up of certain um, a certain physical structure, right? Molecules, atoms, whatever it might be, and I'm made up of a different physical structure. And so, what exactly is the thing that gives, let's say, me more value than this mic? Now, someone may say, "Oh, well, you have rationality." Okay, but why is rationality give me more value than the mic? If the processes are all random, non-rational, right, non-intentional, blind processes, then rationality really shouldn't give me more value than this particular mic. Someone again may say something to the effect of, "Well, you contribute to society," but even that, why is that valuable? At the end, what makes that more valuable than the mic itself? Even if I, let's say, contribute financially or economically, why is that more valuable? And that question becomes, again, meaningless. So there's no way to establish one or any sort of hierarchy when it comes to value. So the entire concept, again, this is a logical conclusion, the entire concept of, let's say, human rights completely crumbles. Because if you're going to say human rights, then you have to ask the question, well, why are those rights rights? Or who made those rights rights? Now, from comparing that with the Islamic standpoint, we understand that those rights come from a source that transcends the human being. That's an objective kind of source that is able to give value because of what that source is. And here we're talking about Allah, God, and because God and who he is and the fact that he created human beings, he's the one that's able to give value and have a hierarchy of value. So he can now give human beings an objective sense of value more than, let's say, the mic or the coffee cup, right? As the Quran mentions, وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي Adam. Indeed, we have honored the conferred dignity and honored the children of Adam. And that comes from a source that transcends the human being. But again, under philosophical naturalism or atheists that have that idea, there's no concept of ultimate value. What about purpose? And purpose is a tricky one because a lot of times we say that we don't really need a purpose or we establish our own purpose. And yet, one of the things that when someone says, my purpose is to join the NBA, right? I mean, I'm 5'4", so that's not never going to happen for me, at least. But anyhow, let's say I assume that, you may make it, you may not, right? But what, in essence, that purpose that person is saying, they're not talking about ultimate purpose, because ultimate purpose is established that has some sort of longevity, that it has some sort of permanence to it. And yet, if the end result is just death and you move from one physical state to another physical state, then what is the meaning of that purpose? That purpose is in fact meaningless. It's like saying, let us pretend to have a purpose. A kind of another way of thinking about this is, imagine that you were in a room that was completely cut off from everything and you were given some toys to play with. And you said, all right, you've got 20 minutes. And so, let's say you've given a Lego set. And so you construct the Lego set, but in 20 minutes, you have to leave the room and then that's it. It's finished. What is the value or meaning of just constructing that Lego set, that Lego piece, right? So from that perspective, from that worldview of philosophical naturalism, or by extension, atheism, there's no ultimate purpose. But of course, from the Islamic framework, we understand that God or Allah has given the human being purpose, right? That purpose from the Islamic framework is to worship God alone and to submit to God and love God, and so on. So there's no ultimate purpose from an atheist worldview or a godless worldview, whereas you find the Islamic paradigm gives a very clear, unequivocal purpose that anyone who's a Muslim or who's been brought up as a Muslim, or even if you're not a Muslim, that person knows that's very clear. Our purpose is to worship God. And what we mean by worship is submission, surrender, obedience, love, gratitude. All of these things come under the concept of worship under the Islamic framework. Okay. I think this might be the last one I'll touch on in terms of last category meaning. And that is no meaningful happiness. Again, I'm going to apologize to Rami here because I'm going to give an example that I've given before, but I think it'll kind of hit the nail on the head. It does. Usually it does. I hope it will. And that is when I talk about no meaningful happiness, the idea that if a person has a framework or a worldview that is one that is established on random processes that are non-intentional, non-rational, they come from a source that's non-rational, if we want to call it a source, and they're blind, then really there's no meaningful happiness. Now, what do I mean by meaningful happiness? Again, we've been in this realm of meaning. So here we're not talking about just a sort of temporal happiness. So here's a thought experiment. I want you to imagine that as you're listening to me speak, and again, I apologize if you've heard this example before, but just play along with us. All right. Let's have this thought experiment. Imagine as you're hearing me speak and you're sitting in your dorm room or your apartment or wherever you are, in the middle of me speaking, you black out. And then when you wake up, you're on a plane. And you're on this plane and you're not in basic economy, but you're in first class. All right. And again, I want you to be with me in this thought experiment. So you're in first class. The seats are amazingly comfortable. I mean, the most comfortable seats that you've ever been in. And as you look out the window, the scenery outside is like this beautiful, orange pinkish hue. So it's very pleasing to the eye. And the temperature, it's perfect. One of the issues we have here in Texas is that people are always fighting about the air conditioner, at least in my house, right? Some people like it colder, some people like it hotter. But for you in this plane, in this first class seat with that beautiful scenery, the temperature is perfect. And you're just moving along. And after a few minutes, you find that you smell something very pleasing. And I want you to think of your favorite food right now, right? So if you're coming from a desi background, it might be biryani or whatever else it is. Whatever background you like, burgers, pizza, falafel, whatever it is, right? Whatever you like, whatever your favorite food is, imagine you smell it from a distance and the cart comes and it presents to you your favorite dish. And you take the first bite, it almost melts in your mouth. It's the most delicious thing that you have ever tasted. Now, if I ask the question, would you be happy in that situation? You might give me a resounding yes, I'd be happy. But would that be meaningful happiness? Or would there not be certain questions that would be bugging you, that are kind of there in the back of your mind? You were in the middle of listening to a talk and you blacked out. Now you're on a plane. Some of the questions I would have is, well, how did I get here? What am I doing here? Why am I here? Why am I in this plane? And perhaps the most important question, where's the plane going, right? Some people say, who's the pilot, right? But where's the plane going? When we think about life, understand that we're on this kind of we're on this metaphoric plane. You come into a certain sense of consciousness at a certain point, and you're on this journey of life, and this journey is going to come to an end. And those existential questions a person might have, where did I come from? Like, and what am I doing here? In other words, how did I get here? What am I doing here? And where is the plane going? If you extend those out to life, you find that under a worldview that is, again, one based upon philosophical naturalism, where processes are blind, random, non-rational, non-intentional, there's no content there whatsoever. The meaning is nothing. Whereas from the Islamic framework, you find that you have meaningful happiness because those deeper existential questions are clear. Where did you come from? You were created by a being that is perfect. You're created by a being that is merciful, and so on, and all the attributes and names of God that we know of within the Islamic paradigm. And your purpose in life, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, was to worship God, to submit to God, to make correct moral choices. And your end will be a judgment upon that worship, upon those correct, merciful, or moral choices. As such, you'll either be rewarded with paradise or you'll be punished in the hellfire, right? And this whole construct gives you a clear sense of where you came from, what you're doing here, and where the plane is going. So I'm going to go ahead and then kind of conclude there with the kind of the presentation section of what we'll be talking about tonight. But what I want to make clear is that that we have the concept, just to kind of reiterate some of the points, we have the concept of seeking the truth, and that truth is important. We're not saying it's not important, but it doesn't have an epistemic cage where you place yourself in and say, I'm only going to use my rationality and that's it, because there are things that you need in order for rationality to work, right? Someone once said that, look, a person that says I can rationally solve anything is like a person who says I have the perfect solvent. It can dissolve anything. But you still want to ask that person, what bottle will you keep it in? Even if you have the perfect solvent. Rationality is a great solvent. It can solve many things and get us to a very far point, but you still need to keep it in a bottle. It's one that is not soluble, right? That's why we say that Allah is absolute, that which is not solvable, that which is not soluble. And you need that in order for you to progress and have a worldview that is coherent and one that is full of meaning. So I'll go ahead and stop here, and I think we can open up for questions if you like, inshallah.
SubhanAllah, Jazakallah Shaykh. Jazakallah khair, Shaykh. I appreciate that. I love it all. Thank you so much. In perfect timing, by the way.
Alhamdulillah.
So
All right.
If anyone has questions on the presentation, you can type them in the chat, or you can unmute your audio and ask away.
Yeah, I always say if there's no questions, then either the presentation was stellar or the presentation totally sucked. It's one of the two.
Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah khairan. It's super fascinating, and you covered so many topics that each could take hours. So
yes.
great job. So like the case you present is very compelling, and I actually struggle to find to think of like how someone would hear this and have trouble like accepting some of these very compelling arguments. But sometimes, like I was once talking with a friend, and he was taking an approach that was purely logical. He was saying, okay, there's no meaning to life, there's no purpose to life, so what? Like there's no hope, there's no ultimate hope, so what?
Sure.
Like he's saying this is separate from truth.
Yep.
Like this is something that makes me feel good, but let's say I don't care about that. This is separate from truth. So right. To that, what's the argument? Like
well,
like yeah, go ahead.
So like I said, I mean, we definitely the main important thing is truth, and when it comes to truth, we want to have certainty. But just using your rationality alone and saying I will not use any other epistemic tool cannot get you to certainty. It can only get you to skepticism, which again is meaningless, you know. And so if the person doesn't care about meaning, right? So in essence, they're saying it doesn't matter whether I'm certain or uncertain. I can just leave myself alone. So I think that's where the structure of what I was saying is taking the person. Is just saying that even within the realm of understanding the truth, you can't come to a position of certainty. You know, it won't get you to certainty. It can only get you to doubt if you take it to its, let's say, logical conclusion.
I see, makes sense. And I think he actually said like, yeah, I don't. So what if I don't have certainty? But at this point, there's nothing to be said, right? It's just.
Yeah, and then if you say you doubt everything, then do you doubt your doubt? And then where do you go? Where do you go with that, right? All right, khalas, end of discussion, right? Then there's nothing more to really talk about at that point, you know.
Makes sense. Thank you.
No problem.
We have a question in the chat. It says, Jazakallah khair, Ustad. My question is, how do we go about addressing objectivity versus subjectivity following an Islamic worldview?
Oh, wow. That's not a question. That's a series. Like, so are we talking about objectivity versus subjectivity when we talk about morals? Are we talking about epistemology, like how we know what we know? Because it depends, right? So from let's say an epistemological answer for that question, we would say what we deem to be objectively true, or let's say, objectively, our sources of knowledge would not only be rationality, but would also be rooted in revelation. So, but that's from our standpoint, from an epistemological standpoint, right? But if we're talking about the idea of morals, then that has two components as well. One component is something you find within the fitrah, which is a type of moral intuition. But in order to check that moral intuition, you then have to refer to, not have to, but in many cases, you have to refer back to revelation as well, right? And so while certain things we can understand in terms of, morality be objectively moral, but in terms of some sort of certainty, again, coming back to certainty, you would have to have some source that transcends limited mind and human emotion, and that can only be Allah. And Allah knows best. That's a very abbreviated answer, by the way. Like I said, it's a whole series about objectivity versus subjectivity. So, and actually, I'm the area that I'm working on right now is the concept of beauty itself. So people usually say like, oh, beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. And I actually am trying to make an argument that when it comes to natural beauty, in fact, that's objectively beautiful, right? When we talk about nature and things like that. And that's why Allah refers to, many times refers to reflecting upon the creation, because there's no sort of bias. And the argument that I make is that everything else, even when an artist paints something, you can say that's subjective because you have a being that's creating that piece of art that is limited. But when it comes to beauty and nature, even intuitively, we understand those things because you always want to buy cereal that is natural, right? Or you want things that are natural. If they're natural, marketers understand this, right? So what I'm working on right now is actually even to establish that natural beauty is objectively true. But anyways, that's a separate topic. But so yeah, there's a lot to be spoken about. Alhamdulillah.
Another question in the chat is, under an atheist worldview, or at least those who profess it, do appreciate the beauty and regularity of the natural physical laws. So in what sense do we call that it is based on random processes?
Okay, why? So again, this is kind of one of the problems with the view itself. And this is and many philosophers have brought this up in the sense that we assume rationality, and yet if we assume rationality, how do we attach that to a non-rational process, right? Because if you say that the process is not random, it was ordered, and there was some sort of rationality behind it, then what you're saying is there's something that transcends this entire structure that is rational. And that would, okay, you don't want to call it God, but it has to be something, some sort of something that's directing things in a certain direction. Now, your recourse is to say that, no, there's nothing that's directing things. We came from nothing, right? And that then becomes very difficult to even when you look at like the physical laws, why are there physical laws as opposed to not being physical laws? And in fact, you make that assumption when you work in the scientific realm, that you assume those things. Like you don't assume that if you put together hydrogen and oxygen one day, you'll get water, and the next day you put together hydrogen and oxygen and you get pigeons, right? Like that's not how it works. You assume certain things, and therefore the system works. But the problem is when you take it back far enough, how do you make that logical leap to say, okay, it's the source is non-rational. In other words, because it's nothing, and yet you have these rational conclusions. That's a question within the philosophy of science as well. And that's something that philosophical naturalists haven't really come to a conclusion with. They have to just hang it in abeyance. And that's why many people, when they're asked, I think when Richard Dawkins was asked this question, and also, what's that famous guy that comes on TV a lot? Not a lot, but
Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Neil deGrasse Tyson. And he said, like, what about the philosophy of science? What about philosophy? And they both said similar answers. They said, don't worry about the philosophy, just do the science, right? But the issue is that, you have every single thing that, that you move forward in has a philosophy that's based upon. That very statement, don't worry about the philosophy, just do the science, is a philosophical statement. So really, I mean, it's just, it's an issue that I think philosophical naturalists themselves haven't you can't come to a conclusion about it. You have to leave it alone. Just hang it in abeyance, put it in a box called unsolved problems, and just do the science. Allahu alam.
SubhanAllah. I have a question, unless anyone else has some, but how much longer would you have, Sheikh? I know we started a little bit late for people to come in.
That's fine. Maybe another 15, 20 minutes, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair. I really appreciate that. I'll just wait a little bit. If anyone has any questions, if they want to go before me, they could type them in the chat or let me know. I guess I want to ask, like you touched on philosophy of science earlier and just now, and you also mentioned how the fitra includes like rationality and also how we perceive like beauty, like sunsets and the hues and the colors and everything.
Right.
So in terms of like epistemology, how we know what we know and how we like gain knowledge.
Yeah.
What's your take on like gaining knowledge through science versus like the fitra, and what is the fitra's like inclination toward like the linguistic miracles of the Quran and existence of God?
Okay. So first, I mean, I hope the presentation didn't give the impression that we're like anti-science. That's not like part of the Islamic endeavor, you can say, actually is scientific. What we are, you may say, like what we may say is that we don't say that science is the only epistemic tool a person has, right? Because even that becomes a problem. Because if you say science is the only tool I'm going to use to tell me whether something is true or false, then if you apply that to the question itself, how can science show that science is true or false? You've got a problem, right? Just from the very beginning. So you definitely need something outside of science to even establish science to be a proper epistemic tool. So I'm not denying science. We're not anti-scientists or anti, whatever it might be. We completely embrace the idea of science, and using naturalism as a method, even as a Muslim, it's okay. There's no problem with that. But as long as we don't extend it into the world of philosophy and belief, because that's really what the problem is, right? When it comes to the discussion about the fitrah, these things we get clarity because we understand that our first principle is the fitrah, right? Science's first principle is something like nature is uniform, right? So you have that as a first principle. You cannot prove that, but yet you have to assume that and move forward. And yet we understand our first principle, or like the Muslim first principle, the Islamic first principle, is the fitrah itself. And that has that's true in the area of when we talk about things like science, how we understand certain things, certain phenomena. We're not completely averse to saying that there is a certain supernatural explanation. We don't use it when we do science, but we don't completely deny it either. We say, okay, there's always a possibility. There can always be kind of a break of the natural order, and so on. And fitrah has ramifications in other areas as well. Islamic or morals and ethics. One of the ones that I think is really interesting is that what we know from the fitrah is that every human is born in a state of goodness, right? And that's very different than, let's say, a Trinitarian Christian worldview, where every human is born in a state of sin and in a state of evil. And yet, what we find is that intuitively, when it comes to establishing laws, we use the idea of the fitrah, not using the term fitrah, but the assumption of fitrah, as opposed to the assumption of original sin. And this happens in areas, for instance, when you say innocent until proven guilty, right? You're not guilty of sin until proven innocent. You're innocent, pure, fitri, until proven guilty, right? And this is very deep within Islamic law as well, in what you call qawa'id al-fiqhiyah. Like you've got one of the qa'idas, one of the rules says al-yaqeen la yuzulu bi-shak. Certainty is not removed by doubt. So when a judge is going to give a ruling, what is the thing you're certain about? You're certain about a person's goodness, and therefore the guilt has to be established. And so therefore you're certain about goodness and you're doubtful about their guilt, and you have to have a certain level of proof before you convict someone, right? And that's why I always think it's very unfortunate when people look at Islamic law or look at the Sharia and just look at it in terms of black and white, this the human need for simple heuristics and say, okay, this is, either it's this or it's that. When in essence, there's a lot of sophistication to it. So I don't know if that answered your question or I just went on a tangent, but anyhow.
Yeah, it's definitely subhanAllah. Jazakallah khairan.
Well, yeah,
I really appreciate it.
problem. So any other questions, or was that a terrible presentation? We're done. Or was that a phenomenal presentation and then we're done? Either way.
We got a question in the chat. Also, people are saying it's phenomenal in the chat. So some atheists argue that there could be are innumerable universes, and one of them happens to be this one where we witness this beauty of physical laws. The reason we witness this is because we just happen to be in this particular universe by chance.
Yeah.
But again, this is a philosophical statement and there is no logical proof of this. What are your comments on the multiverse theory?
So I think you kind of answered the question in the question. There's no proof of it, right? So someone that's going to be demanding proof, you'd say, okay, well, what is the proof for a multiverse? Right now, it's just guesswork, and that just leads to skepticism, right? I mean, you could take this all the way to forget like multiverse, like how do you prove you exist? If I said, how do you know your brain isn't in a vat and you're, some scientist on the moon isn't programming every sort of sensation that you have? In fact, your very witnessing and hearing this presentation is not some sort of reality that you are. Your brain is in a vat. There's no way for you to prove it, right? So again, you can claim multiverse, and I think it's a cool concept. I'm a DC fan, and so they use that concept a lot in the DC universe. But and it's fun. And what's really interesting is there is, I think it was is it Ibn Sina or it was Fakhruddin al-Razi who considered the idea of a multiverse in our tradition to say there is a possibility that there could be other universes, right? But not in the sense that there were so many universes, we just happen to be on this one which actually has life. Not from that perspective, but there's a possibility that there are other universes. And he gives his arguments for that, and there's other Islamic philosophers, you can say, who give arguments against that. But again, the idea would be like, what's the proof, right? If you want to say that your only epistemic tool is rationality, we can say, well, we don't accept that. For us, we have an epistemic tool of rationality and we have revelation, right? We have the Quran and we have the example of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so for us, that's an epistemic tool that is valid. And that's how we can, quote unquote, prove it, right? But for someone who says, presents the idea of a multiverse, kun hatu burhanakum in kuntum sadiqin, right? Bring your evidence if you're speaking the truth. And there is none, unfortunately.
SubhanAllah.
All right, what else do we have? Inshallah.
If anyone wants to use the microphone to ask questions, you can do that too, or you can put them in the chat. Otherwise, we can wrap up if there's no more questions.
Just as a follow-up to that,
Sure.
So can you explain again the distinction between like when we say the multiverse theory, there's no proof of it. At the same time, there's no proof of God. We don't have proof of God. It's a faith thing. So what's the distinction again between these two?
Well, because the person, first of all, let's take a step back. One of the things we have to establish is that the idea that we need proof for something, we need to then prove that idea itself, right? So prove that you need proof would be before we even get to the concept, right? Again, this is a comparison of two worldviews. And this is where, if you're a Muslim, you need to really be careful and take a step outside and say, hold on, we're not necessarily going to play by the same rules, right? Like we don't have to play by the same rules, because the logical consistency you need is to say, if you're requiring proof for everything, then you have to prove your proof and so on and so forth, and then be consistent in what you're saying. From our perspective, we're saying that the idea of God is not something that needs a proof. Rather, it's something that's part and parcel of the human being, just like first principles, right? Just like the concept or the idea of prior creative processes. Like that's not something you can prove. And they're self-evidently true. And there's no problem with that, right? I mean, if someone said to you, I believe that the past is not real. Now, who has the burden of proof in this case? The guy that comes to you and says, you know what happened 5 minutes ago? It never really happened, right? Are you going to say, well, let me prove to you the past is real? Or are you going to say, you need to present the evidence, right? The one who rejects that which is self-evidently true is the one that has the burden of proof, right? And so therefore, we're saying that God is self-evidently true, right? Whether you want to look at it from prior creative processes, whether you want to look at it from, and I mentioned that if we had time, we talk about semiotics, but this idea of things are signs for things that have deeper meaning, right? Our entire structure of language is based on semiotics in the sense that when words are constructed, they mean something. They're pointing to something else. If you say microphone, right, there's a reality of the microphone, then there's the word microphone, and I'm attaching this reality to the word, right? And that's why even when someone say utterance, it's that which is outed, right? Yeah, and in Arabic you say lafz, right? Lafada, it's something that's thrown out of the mouth. Yeah, and the idea is that you're attaching some sort of meaning to it. So the word microphone is a sign for what this thing is, right? And so this sign-based thinking is very different than, let's say, a rational, purely rational-based thinking. So we're not confined to the epistemology to say you have to bring proof, right? That, in fact, is an epistemological bias that needs to be pointed out. I hope that made that clearer. Maybe I made that worse.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. And just, you said semiotics. The word is
semiotics is the word. Yeah. So semiotics occurs when we talk about things like when philosophers study things like general signs. So we look at like the golden arches, right? Immediately there's a certain phenomena that you have in your mind when you see the golden arches, right? So maybe it's like you start thinking about, that amazing cheeseburger that you had or whatever it is, right? If you're Muslim, you probably think of some nasty filet of fish. That's besides the point, right? But anyways, but it's just based on that one golden arches that you see, and that's the attachment of meaning and to signs. And we say that that has an extension within nature too. When you look at certain things within nature, you have a certain type of internal state. So sometimes when you see something like a beautiful mountain, you're put in a state of awe. And so therefore that state of awe that you internally feel, it's not a rational endeavor, but yet it has a certain meaning. That feeling of majesty of the mountain, and then how much greater is the majesty of the one that created the mountain, and so on. And the Quran uses this concept of semiotics. But semiotics, it's applied in general, the science of signs, and also in the philosophy of language. So language, they say that our entire communicative endeavor is semiotic, because you're using something to refer to something else, and those are words. So, Allahu Alam.
SubhanAllah. We have 2 more questions in the chat. Hopefully you still have a few more minutes.
Sure.
So, is it accurate to regard atheism as a belief system rather than the absence of?
Sorry, say that again. I missed it.
Is it accurate to regard atheism as a belief system rather than the absence of?
Is it a belief system or the? Yeah, because to say that someone has a belief in nothing is not true. Because if you say I believe in nothing, but you're still saying I believe, it's a positive quality, right? So you're still making a positive statement. So no one can say I have a zero-line basis of belief. You have to believe in something, right? And that's just part of the human project, is that there's nowhere to go, The issue that arises is that under atheism, you can never be certain about it. There's no such thing as a positive case for atheism. You cannot prove atheism, let's put it that way, right? The best that someone who is an atheist can do is bring up something like the problem of evil. But even that, once an explanation is provided, that's especially in the Islamic framework, that just falls apart. So I think that you can't say that just devoid of belief. You can say that you have something, you hang your hat on something. So yeah.
SubhanAllah. These have been really good questions and brilliant responses, Sheikh. So this other question, would you say then that a sort of leap of faith or believing in something without hard proof is necessary for achieving meaningful happiness, i.e., without this divine belief, there can be no meaning.
So here's the thing. Again, we're kind of in this. We want to take a, how do I put this? A macro view of the very concept of proof itself, right? We want to transcend proof for a second, right? Because, and this is a phenomena that, it may take some time to actually to step outside of this, in a sense, of yourself, right? Because we've been so accustomed to, I'm not going to believe it until you prove it to me. And yet the reality is most things we believe, we're not presented with proof, right? We don't, if you said, I'm not going to believe it unless, I use my own senses, right? That unless I'm able to see it myself or experience it myself, I'm just not going to believe it. And yet most of the information, dare I say, that you know to be true doesn't come from that process, doesn't come from an empirical process of your testing and your seeing and your observation, right? Most of it comes from what we call testimony, right? From the say-so of others. So even the science someone would do, that's not based on one individual doing all the experiments. In fact, it's based upon you reading the research of someone who maybe read the research of someone who read the research of someone who did the experiment. So you still rely on testimony, right? And no one can say, I'm going to have a testimonial-less worldview, right? So if someone said, okay, prove to me without testimony, the world is round. You can't do it, right? You can say, okay, well, I saw a picture. Well, that's the say-so of somebody else, right? You say, if you traveled around the earth, right, you wouldn't fall off. Okay, have you done that? No. How do you know that? Well, I read it in a book, right? So this concept of, this idea of leap of faith and then, we don't have proof and this sort of thing, it's not a negative thing. Because again, if you take this idea of proof to its logical conclusion, you can only come to doubt because you can't come to certainty. And what the Islamic paradigm does, it gives you strong certainty because it combines rationality with a fitri-based type of, you can say, thinking, which is based in spirituality. And that's another topic in and of itself, that the more you are spiritually closer to God, the more you know. So for example, there's a dua of the Prophet ﷺ where he says, Allahumma arina al-haqqa haqqa wa razuqna ittiba'ah. Oh Allah, show me truth as truth and allow me to follow it. That's in the form of a dua, which the Prophet ﷺ said is mukhali ba'd, right? Is the bone marrow, the crux of worship. So worship and spirituality, these things, they have this beautiful balance along with rationality that give you a coherent worldview. So we have to kind of get out of this thinking of everything we have requires proof. It doesn't. And in fact, the only place everything requiring proof would take you to is skepticism, which falls in upon itself. Allahu alam.
SubhanAllah. Someone said, Jazakallah khair, Shaykh, for an amazing talk, and Jazakallah khair, Rami, and any others for organizing.
All right.
I think that's pretty much all we have for questions. I want to respect your time, Shaykh.
Good. Jazakallah khair. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless all of you that are here. May Allah give you all the best of this life and the best of the afterlife. If I said anything that was mistaken or if I offended someone, it wasn't my intention. I ask you to forgive me for that. Other than that, I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless you, bless your families, keep you safe, and keep you patient and strong in these trying times that we're in, especially with COVID and everything else. I can definitely, if you have questions later on, Rami, if you want to, shoot my email out. I don't promise I'll get back to you right away because I do quite a bit, but I will try to get to the question as much as I can, or at least give you resources. And I'm going to make a shameless plug. Can I do that, Rami, right now?
Yes, for sure. For sure.
I'd like you all to visit sapiensinstitute.org. Actually, I don't think it's .com. Sapiens Institute. There's a lot of classes and information and articles that we offer. We have one course that we did recently called No Doubt, which is about 10 strategies about how to deal with doubt in Islam, right? So I would highly encourage that. And there's a lot of other really good articles and a lot of other people on there that are infinitely better than myself. This is not, I'm not trying to be humble or anything like that, but in reality, they just, they far surpass anything that I can present or anything that I can articulate. So I'm going to highly recommend you visit that. The stuff on there is all free, by the way. So I'm not making a shameless plug to get any sort of money or anything like from you, inshallah. But all right. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless all of you and accept from all of us. Jazakumullah khair.
Jazakallah khair.
All right. Take care.
Thank you so much, Sheikh. I really appreciate it. Thank you guys for coming. Ma salama.
Jazakallah. Thank you.